Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is February 16th, Friday, February 16th, 2018. Just in case you were worried that you were listening to a rerun. No, it's not a rerun. There was another school shooting, not another one today after Florida. We're on the downslope of, you have to be careful about this. I just realized as I'm saying, yes, I'm on the downslope of the Florida shooting. We're still dealing with the fallout of that one. There hasn't been another one since then that I know of. I just want to put that out there. I guess anything is possible. But no, didn't want to alarm anybody that we thought we were on another one. We're just dealing with this one. It, of course, still being too soon to talk about this one, except that it's never been too soon, and that political excuse, thankfully, dead for some time. Although there are still some people who throw that one out there, and I guess, what's her name? The blonde lady that blabs about everything. Other side, Tomi Lauren, I think. And I know people delight in getting her name wrong on purpose. I just actually got it wrong by accident. But, yeah, she's still perpetuating that one. I did see her out there rather prominently insisting, my goodness, as she said, my goodness, grasping at pearls, my goodness, can't the left wait a day? Yeah, right, well, whatever. We're done with that one. Daily Coast Radio is live right now, as we were reminded by Bill from Portland, Maine, all the way from far away. How is it? How's the weather up there? It's 300 degrees. Nothing wrong with the planet out there. It's quite warm, and I believe it's going to snow on us on Saturday, tomorrow. So I guess we'll all be sick on Monday, even though it's a holiday. And no surprise there for a lot of us. Let's see. What are we going to catch up on today? Daily Coast's Radio. Daily Coast's Radio. Hey, thanks. How's your radio doing, Daily Coast? We're live now. That's what I know. Kagro X, that's me, and that's how you can reach me on Twitter during the course of the show. Why not redirect the show? It's doing great so far. We can't do any worse with whatever you suggest. We assure a weary nation that our long national nightmare is coming to an end. Mitt Romney is back and running for the Senate. Yes, it's true. Ignoring all the advice to shut up and go away or learn knitting after losing a race for the presidency, he is back and running for Senate from Utah. And I don't know what to tell you about that because, oh my God, what state is this guy from? I mean, I don't know. I find the whole thing very weird. Yes, it's Utah. Yes, it's full of Mormons. It's like the head state of Mormons. They're all over the place. But Utah is their home base, and we shall not establish any state religion except for that one, I guess. And fine, Utah is where he's going to run from. He lives in California. He's been governor of Massachusetts. He's running for Senate from Utah. Whatever, man. I mean, and I guess are we briefly supposed to believe that, well, he'll run as an anti-Trump? I mean, the head of the Republican Party in Utah, I guess, thinks so, or at least thought it would be within bounds to point out that this was not a great thing that he's running for Senate from Utah because he's never been a Trump supporter. And but I offer that up only to let us all focus one more time on where the Republican Party is and how much it's been co-opted by the Trump machine. And I mean, yes, they were like this before. No, Trump isn't anything particularly new for the Republicans. And also, truth to tell, this is the way the party apparatus I guess on both sides, actually works, and you kind of have to become a cheerleader for the president, or at least it's been typically the case that that's what happens. But then again, that's when things are normal, and this is not normal, so it's worth noting when this happens. But I just thought I'd point that out, that the chairman of the Republican Party in Utah thinks this is not necessarily a good thing, specifically because he's been on the record as critical of Trump. On the other hand, everyone ought to be reminded that when Trump won the presidency, Mitt Romney was right in line with the rest of them, lining up to have dinner with the guy on the off chance that he might get a position of power in the Trump administration. Now, you might say, or he may say, granted that all of this was before we knew just how bad things would really get under Donald Trump and what an autocrat he was and what a fascist he was and what a racist and misogynist he was, except, of course, none of that would be true. But F that. Gimmitarianism. I want it to be true today, so that's that, and I'm going to claim that. I mean, I don't know. To the extent that people are listening in Utah, I guess, don't fall for it. Take the advice of many people who organize their thoughts better than I do. Boycott voting for Republicans at the ballot box. They don't deserve it, and it might just be one giant cabal to sign our lives away to, I don't know who, Vladimir Putin, I guess. I was a little out there the other day. I'm still there, by the way. I'm not saying I'm pulling back from the position, but a little out there the other day, just talking about how one day, eventually, I guess, Republicans would have to, I guess, defend the positions Donald Trump was taking by saying you're criminalizing politics, and if the duly elected, whatever that means, president of the United States, whatever that means, wants to overtly make it public policy to enter our country into political union with the Russian Federation, well, then that's a legitimate position to take. And I guess we would have to accept that. We would just have to, because rules are rules and something. But interestingly, this morning, boy, there's a lot going on. Why don't we start with something serious rather than say the Playboy playmate who says she also had an affair with Donald Trump, because that's out there too, and instead turn to James Risen writing in The Intercept, which we know means that Glenn Greenwald thinks it's awesome. Of course, he doesn't. And I guess that speaks well of things, the editorial operations over at The Intercept. You can write this stuff over at The Intercept and publish it and still make Glenn Greenwald unhappy with it. Maybe he didn't. Maybe Glenn Greenwald is 100% behind this. I don't know. It doesn't matter. We're going to read it. Is Donald Trump a traitor? The answer, of course, is yes. James Risen is the guy writing the answer. I don't know whether he really gives it here, but if it's not in this article, don't worry, because this is only part one of at least two parts. It says part 2 is coming soon. I don't know whether there's a part 3 or not. We all remember the history behind James Risen, his relationship with previous publishers, the reason he's at The Intercept today. It must be, I don't know, maybe a great relief to realize that your story can actually run, even though a significant portion of The Intercept's editorial staff has been very heavily invested for whatever reason, and I don't think it's nefarious. I just think they believe this, but it might end up being wrong. They could still be proven right in part or in toto, I guess. But they still believe that the Trump-Russia story is some sort of a red herring. And whatever. In the meantime, this is being published. Is Donald Trump a traitor? I believe he is. Of course, by the way, let's just throw out there that, when it's actual treason, there's an actual death penalty on the line. But if you say that, then you're threatening the president and they come and arrest you and Secret Service, etc. It's just one of those gray areas that there's just no settled law in. What do you do? Is telling the president that he's going to be on trial for treason and or convicting and sentencing him a violation of federal law because you're threatening his life, or is he no longer the president at that point? Well, it's unsettled. Some say yes, some say no. We'll just have to wait and see. Trump and Russia, part 1. Part 2, it says, is coming soon. I don't know if this is part 1 of Trump and Russia or whether Trump and something else is the subject of part 2. But if I keep going like this, we're never going to get through the article. It starts off with this subheader, by the way. Americans must live with the uncertainty of not knowing whether Trump has the best interests of the United States or those of Russia at heart. We're also living with the prospect that he has nothing in particular at all at heart, or has no heart, or doesn't have the best interest of the United States, but not necessarily the best interest of Russia either. He just has his own best interests. Sometimes they'll overlap, sometimes they won't. Usually they won't. We have a whole system of laws in place to supposedly do something about that, because the base assumption is that if you don't have the best interests of the United States at heart, overlapping on occasion isn't enough. It's supposed to be your top priority. Emoluments, yada yada, bribery, treason laws, whatever. But it's all just dusty stuff on a bookshelf, because really, honestly, if you get out there with a propaganda machine and can say, I don't know what, or distract people with other crap, then I guess you just get to continue in office while we all scratch our heads and wonder what to do. I find it hard to write about Donald Trump. I do. But this is actually James Risen, who is writing about Donald Trump. It's very hard, so give him props. He's doing something very hard. I find it impossible to write about him. I find it nearly impossible to talk about him. I find it impossible to read something someone else has already organized thought-wise and put down on electronic paper for me to read. It's that confusing. It's that difficult to deal with the subject of Donald Trump, because no rules apply and you have to stop every couple of words and say, well, ordinarily something, but this isn't normal, YOLO, nothing matters, and it's hard to get through an article that way. I find it hard to write about Donald Trump. It is not that he is a complicated subject. Quite the opposite. It is that everything about him is so painfully obvious. Agreed. He is a low-rent racist. Agreed. A shameless misogynist. Agreed. And an unbalanced narcissist. Agreed. I'm going to turn James Risen into a narcissist before the end of this article. He is an unrelenting liar. Yes. And a two-bit white identity demagogue. Uh-huh. Lest anyone forget these things, he goes out of his way each day to remind us of them. Yeah. Weird. At the end of the day, he is certain to be left in the dustbin of history alongside Father Coughlin and General Edwin Walker. Parenthetically, he adds, exactly. You don't remember them either. Some of you do, of course. What more can I add? That's it. That's it for part one. I think you're done. All right. There's more. Unfortunately, another word also describes him. President. That is weird. And by the way, thanks to the Electoral College for all of this. I know it's been painful, it's been awkward, but it's all been worth it, Electoral College. You have protected us from the caprices of popular mania, etc., etc. You were handed the opportunity, of course, to actually do something about it. You were being prevailed upon like at no time before in modern history, and maybe in the entire history of China, for all I know, to actually exercise your prerogative and say, yeah, to hell with this. This is not happening in this country, period. Because we've bound you to the results instead of the popular vote in your states, which... one of those crazy gray areas, I guess, one of those confusing, nuanced areas. On the one hand, you absolutely do want the winner of the popular vote to come out on top. On the other hand, the bizarre effect of binding electors in the Electoral College to the popular results within their states results in the election of a president who not only doesn't win the popular vote nationally, but is crushed nationally. But at least we preserved the system that was handed to us to avoid the embarrassment, disaster, insult, whatever you want to put it, however you want to express it, of electing someone so unfit for office and perhaps so obviously in the thrall of a foreign power that it would be a disaster forever after were you to acknowledge him as the duly elected president. But we prevailed upon the Electoral College. This is too dangerous. You should not do it. And they said, our hands are tied, which is, of course, the entirety of the reason for the existence of the Electoral College, so that hands would not be tied, but we have tied them instead because we lived too long in normal times and got complacent and thought there's no way the voters of the several states would be so stupid as to overlook this, except then they did, and then there was nothing to do about it because the people in whom the power ultimately resided, according to our Constitution, to elect a president, had their hands tied so that they didn't do anything rash, like exercise the prerogative that justifies their very existence. It's been worth it. It's been a fun ride. There's been some ups and downs, Electoral College, but it's totally worth it. You've totally protected the national security of the country, the integrity of our elections. It's been really awesome. Looking forward to working with you more in the future. I'm pointing at you. You the man, and some of you are women, Electoral College. Excellent. Well done. What more can James Risen add? Oh, as it turns out, there's more words here. I'm going to continue with this before it's time for me to say that it's almost time for our break, which it's not yet. Here we go. Unfortunately, another word describes him, president, right? The fact that such an unstable egomaniac occupies the White House is the greatest threat to the national security of the United States in modern history, and also the history of China. That should be the end of the article, but it's not. It instead brings him to the only question about Donald Trump that I find really interesting. Is he a traitor? Did he gain the presidency through collusion with Russian President Vladimir Putin? That's two questions, James. You're already off track. The only question about Donald Trump that I find interesting, is he a traitor? But here's another one. Did he gain the presidency through collusion with the Russian president? And by the way, you can still be a traitor even if you did not. I just thought I'd point that out. You could have even gained the presidency legitimately and still found yourself a traitor at heart, because there was never a point at which you had the interests of the United States first at heart. But okay, he separates the questions. 1 year after Trump took office, it is still unclear whether the president of the United States is an agent of a foreign power. It's becoming clear. Just step back and think about that for a moment. Okay, and now I'm starting to get annoyed, like James Risen is the only dude who ever thought of this, but what else are you going to write? His 2016 campaign is the subject of an ongoing federal inquiry that could determine whether Trump or people around him worked with Moscow to take control of the U.S. government. That sounds interesting. Americans must now live with the uncertainty of not knowing whether the president has the best interests of the United States or those of the Russian Federation at heart, or some third thing, which is also a possibility. Most pundits in Washington now recoil at any suggestion that the Trump-Russia story is really about treason. That is weird, and we're going to have to help overcome that. It's the same recoiling they used to do at the I word when you had really bad situations. And so now we can have them. We have most of them at the point where they say, yeah, there really is something to this Trump-Russia thing, but I'm afraid to admit what it might really mean. We'll impeach him because he's really terrible at being president, as opposed to, if we're really talking about treason, should we throw it out on the table here? Should we put this out there? We did a pretty good job. I mean, it didn't really kick in until 2 presidencies down the road. But I think if you credit activists or me or someone else, I don't think I can credit myself for this because it didn't work. Like it didn't normalize the idea of impeachment for George W. Bush. But I feel like it helped prepare us for discussion of impeachment under Donald Trump, although I feel like we were going to get there anyway. But maybe we need to lay the groundwork. It's not really, if all of this ends up to being true, if James Risen is onto something, then, I don't know. I'm going to read you the Constitution. I guess, right? Although I don't think that I don't know. Anyway, the point is, impeachment is a cure for the president's treason, but, we might as well I'm just kind of pointing things out. The arrest and execution of the president really would be what was called for if he were really and truly guilty of the actual technical definition of treason as set forth in the Constitution and everything. But obviously, it's going to be a little uncomfortable. Let me ask you this. Supposing it's proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? Can you envision Chuck Todd getting on television saying, well, our hands are tied, just as they were with the Electoral College. We got into a bad situation with tinkering with the Electoral College. We haven't tinkered much with the treason thing. We just haven't had reason to do so, but our hands are tied. The Constitution says what it says. The law says what it says. Gonna have to have a hearing on the applicability of the death penalty here for our convicted president. So tune in to NBC Live for the execution or whatever. Or does he say, well, really, we should execute a president of both sides? And the most recent and available Democratic president in this situation, of course, Barack Obama. So we'll execute them both at the same time to be fair to both. What does Chuck Todd or somebody like that do with the truth at the heart of what James Risen is arguing here? I can't say whether it's true or not and swear on a stack of Bibles or whatever other book you think would make me burst into flame and be sentenced forever to hell if I lied, whatever your belief system may be. And there are very few of you listening who believe that. But, we have to stick to the conventions that were handed by our country, etc. How do you think that would go? How do you think that gets reported? How does Fox and Friends deal with this? Oh, my God. I mean, well, we're not going there. Don't panic. Most pundits in Washington now recoil, as he says, at any suggestion that the Trump-Russia story is really about treason. They all want to say it's about something else. What? They aren't quite sure. They are afraid to use serious words. You see why. They are in the business of breaking down the Trump-Russia narrative into a long series of bite-sized incremental stories. Bad news for incrementalism. In which the gravity of the overall case often gets lost. I think that's right. They seem to think that treason is too much of a conversation stopper. Execution is, anyway. That it interrupts the flow of cable television and Twitter. God forbid you might upset the right wing, and the left wing, for that matter. Oh, God, you're looking to get fired from The Intercept, James. But if a presidential candidate or his lieutenants secretly work with a foreign government that is a longtime adversary of the United States to manipulate and then win a presidential election, well, golly gee whiz, that is almost a textbook definition of treason. Almost, but, on the other hand, some other thing. And so technically, in Article 3, Section 3, the U.S. Constitution states that treason against the United States shall consist only, to keep things simple, in levying war, capital W, war against them. And remember, Donald Trump loves those random capitalization. And it's not random in the Constitution, but okay. It's just archaic. Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, the United States in the plural, or in adhering to their enemies and giving them aid and comfort. Whereas allowing them to allow you to offer other people comfort on a luxurious scale never before seen in the history of China in a Trump Tower International Hotel in Beijing or anything like that. Does that count? Is the real question. Based on that provision in the Constitution, U.S. Law 18, U.S. Code Section 2381 states, and it states that because, oh my God, I said Section 2381, that's so official sounding. It does state this. States that, quote, whoever owing allegiance to the United States levies war against them or adheres to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere, is guilty of treason. That's the code we would use to sentence somebody over that. We would we talk about the Constitution, but we wouldn't point at it during trial necessarily. And golly, and as I'm reading it, I don't really know that Section 2381 says that, but I'm going to trust James Risen because he's quoting sources. But LOL, YOLO, nothing matters. I mean, maybe that section doesn't say anything. Should we have a fact check or check it? At what point this is why we can never sentence this guy for his treason. We're going to be constantly looking up. Does that say that? Is everything fake news? Are we in a simulation? Is that what happened? Is Oliver Willis right ultimately? So here we get to it. It's in this paragraph. I'm not making it up. I haven't read through the article. I just happen to know where James Risen is going on this. Those found guilty of this high crime, quote, and this according to the code here, shall suffer death or be imprisoned not less than 5 years, that is a big difference, and fined under this title, but not less than $10,000, and shall be incapable of holding any office under the United States. So don't panic, don't crap your pants. If the president is guilty of treason, you can fine him $10,000 and send him to jail for 5 years and say he's incapable of holding any office under the United States. I mean, on the other hand, you might say, well, I just constructed Trump's lawyer's defense on this. This is not constitutional. This is double jeopardy because I am already incapable of holding office under the United States. And so, therefore, I mean, you got to drop the charges. That's where we may be with this. But, all right, James Risen, credit to you for being the first one willing to put their name to it in print. Yeah, death penalty for Donald Trump. Now, I'm just saying that's what I'm just quoting the U.S. Code here. The Secret Service presumably has no case against me for that. I'm reading the United States Criminal Code aloud, and, you know, Donald Trump is the prospective defendant. I don't find it really particularly attractive as an option. I do. I love it. It would be fantastic. But within the bounds of law. That's all I'm saying. I just want everybody to understand what I'm saying. Before I go to break for our first commercial interruption of the... Oh, my God. Can you believe I'm bumping up against commercial interruption talking about, well, maybe it's legal to execute the president of the United States. Maybe he's not the president. I don't know. Is that my excuse? Anyway. Oh, boy. All right. Well, we'll play the music, though this time there's nobody to warn on the phone about the impending break. And I'll tell you this. There's much, much more to come about the treason of the President of the United States, Donald Trump. What a wacky morning Friday show. Holy cow. There's really no dealing with it. We might as well linger on this subject because the only one other out there is school shootings. This is the least depressing of the two, believe it or not. We'll be right back. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching Kagro X or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Oh, my God. We got to re-enter the story about whether or not the president is a traitor. And now we have to, oh, my God, what if we would consider the possibility that we are being manipulated by Russians into reading the James Risen article to create political instability in the United States? And I don't know, I guess anything's a possibility now. But again, all I'm doing is reading you the U.S. Code and what this one guy wrote about it. I'm returning to the article. I can do nothing else. Otherwise, it's just more chaos. Now, look at the mandate given to former FBI Director Robert Mueller when he was appointed special counsel by Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who was acting in place of Attorney General Jeff Sessions, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, I think, maybe not, who recused himself because of his role in the Trump campaign and the controversy, Parleo and Gideon, I'm going to throw you that one, controversy surrounding his own meetings with the Russian ambassador to the United States, which is weird to have held. Even in a transition, it would have been a little bit weird, but it was, of course, well before then. On May 17th, 2017, Rosenstein issued a letter stating that he was appointing a special counsel to, quote, ensure a full and thorough investigation of the Russian government's efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election, unquote. He added that Mueller's mandate was to investigate, quote, a lot of quotes here, any links and or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the campaign of President Donald Trump and any matters that arose or may arise directly from the investigation, unquote. Rosenstein noted that if, quote, I feel like this should just be one big quote here, if the special counsel believes it is necessary and appropriate, the special counsel is authorized to prosecute federal crimes arising from the investigation of these matters, unquote. How closely aligned is Mueller's mandate with the legal definition of treason? That boils down to the rhetorical differences between giving, quote, again, aid and comfort in the United States or elsewhere, unquote, to, quote, enemies, unquote, of the United States and, quote, any links and or coordination, unquote, between the Russian government and Trump campaign aides related to, yes, quote, the Russian government's efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election, unquote. Sounds similar to me, James says. As a practical matter, the special counsel is highly unlikely to pursue treason charges against Trump or his associates. I think that's probably well worth saying. As we've been debating up until now, that he'd be highly unlikely to pursue any kind of charges against Trump or his associates, as opposed to referring charges to Congress with an eye toward their impeaching him. This Congress, as currently constituted, it wouldn't make any difference what you referred them. But it may make no difference even what you refer to a Democratic Congress either. Already, by the way, pushback on let's not talk about the I word and, the lead up to the elections. We may lose if that option is out there. I suppose, by the way, holding out the opportunity to try the president for treason and execute him under the statutes, probably also not very good for electoral prospects, though you got my vote, but you need more than that. It would be so much easier, I agree now, with George W. Bush if I were the dictator. But, we're supposed to look askance at that. To the extent that it is defined, I'm sorry, I shouldn't skip ahead here. As a practical matter, yes, it's going to be a low percentage play, let's say, to bet on whether or not the special counsel files treason charges. Treason is vaguely defined in the law and very difficult to prove. To the extent that it is defined as providing aid and comfort to an enemy, quote unquote enemy of the United States, the question might come down to whether Russia is legally considered America's enemy. That's true. We do have that difficulty that we didn't have in exactly the same way at the time of the founding, et cetera, et cetera. Or do you need a declaration of war to make them an enemy? Whatever. Who knows? So yeah, big question mark there. Don't bet on it anytime soon. Russia may not meet the legal definition of an enemy, but it is certainly an adversary of the United States. It would make perfect sense for Russian president and de facto dictator Vladimir Putin to use his security services to conduct a covert operation to influence American politics to Moscow's advantage. Why not, right? Sure, I would do it. Such a program would fall well within the acceptable norms of great power behavior. That's true. When you're dealing with screwing up another country, though it wouldn't be normal, it's kind of expected. And by the way, you'll find that illustrated every other day of the year, and all the other virtual pages of The Intercept. We're constantly being reminded, quite truthfully, for the most part, that the United States engages in these practices as against other adversaries or even friends around the world all the time. So why then it's so difficult to believe that the Russians might also be engaging in it, I have no idea. But something, blah, 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 very large Twitter following, therefore whatever. And I live in Brazil anyway, so it's cool. Let's move on. Yes, so the Russians are likely to be doing this thing. Such a program would fall well within the acceptable norms of great power behavior. After all, it is the kind of covert intelligence program the United States has conducted regularly against other nations, including Russia. There you go. That's how they keep them employed there at The Intercept. It's true. Throughout the Cold War, the CIA and the KGB were constantly engaged in such secret intelligence battles, although it was always the stuff of fantasy that they could ever get to the point where we're going to put mind-controlled drugs in the Ovaltine, and then America will elect a Soviet president, and you know how the rest of that science fantasy goes. The KGB had a nickname for the CIA. It's written here in transliterated Russian. Let's see. Glavny, how do you pronounce it? Glavny Vrag, or the main enemy. That would be the CIA as opposed to the United States. Glavny Vrag. Glavny, I have no idea. It's transliterated here, Glavnyy. Vrag, V-R-A-G. Glavny Vrag. It's Y's instead of A's like Hawaiian here. Okay. I'll take your word for it. I'm taking a lot of words for it today. In 2003, James Risen says, I co-authored a book called The Main Enemy with Milt Bearden, the retired CIA officer who had been chief of the CIA's Soviet/Eastern European division when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. The book was about the intelligence wars between the CIA and the KGB. Today's cyber spy wars are just the latest version of, quote, the Great Game, the wonderfully romantic name for the secret intelligence battles between the Russian and British empires for control of Central Asia in the 19th century. Russia, the United States, and other nations engage in such covert intelligence games all the time, whether they are enemies or simply rivals. In fact, evidence of the connections between Trump's bid for the White House and Russian ambitions to manipulate the 2016 U.S. election keeps piling up. Throughout late 2016 and early 2017, a series of reports from the U.S. intelligence community and other government agencies underlined and reinforced nearly every element of the Russian hacking narrative, including the Russian preference for Trump. The reports were notable in part because their findings exposed the agencies to criticism from Trump and his supporters and put them at odds with Trump's public dismissals of reported Russian attempts to help him get elected, which he has called fake news. In addition, a series of details has emerged through unofficial channels that seems to corroborate these authorized assessments. A classified NSA document obtained by The Intercept last year states that Russia's military intelligence agency, the GRU, played a role in the Russian hack of the 2016 American election. In August, a Russian hacker confessed to hacking the Democratic National Committee under the supervision of an officer in Russia's Federal Security Service, or FSB, who has separately been accused of spying for the U.S. and what? Is a hacker, Russian hacker, confessed to hacking the DNC under the supervision of the FSB, who has, so I guess this hacker has separately been accused of spying for the U.S. by the FSB or somebody else? I don't know. That's a very convoluted sentence. And Dutch intelligence service AIVD, we read on the show, has reportedly given the FBI significant inside information about the Russian hack of the Democratic Party. Given all of this, it seems increasingly likely that the Russians have pulled off the most consequential covert action operation since Germany put Lenin on a train back to Petrograd in 1917, and that worked out beautifully for them. There are 4 important tracks, that's too many, to follow in the Trump-Russia story. First, we must determine whether there is credible evidence for the underlying premise that Russia intervened in the 2016 election to help Trump win. Second, we must figure out whether Trump or people around him worked with the Russians to try to win the election. Next, we must scrutinize the evidence to understand whether Trump and his associates have sought to obstruct justice by impeding a federal investigation into whether Trump and Russia colluded. A fourth track concerns whether Republican leaders are now engaged in a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice through their intense and ongoing efforts to discredit Mueller's probe. I would agree. Those are good 4 pillars. Before I even continue with this, I will point out again my crazy theory about, maybe you're just politicizing or criminalizing politics if the Republican Party wins complete control of the United States government and makes it an overt goal to enter into political union with the Russian Federation, and there isn't too much you can do about it. It calls into question whether or not there even is something that you could term obstruction of justice if the unitary executive as President of the United States is sometimes referred to, if the unitary executive directs the Department of Justice and related agencies not to pursue the investigation, well, what do you do with that? And I guess that also is a gray area. And I suppose to the extent that the effort at completing political union between the two entities is overt, you would be able to point to that and say, well, that, although, you would want to point that out, you would want the ability to argue that it was an open platform on which the American people went to the polls. And you'd still probably have the opportunity to say, that was a hidden agenda, and we didn't really get a chance to ratify that. And the fact that we have legitimized, apparently, the Trump presidency with our votes, which we haven't because he lost by 3 to 5 million votes, and the Electoral College elected him and not the people. And though we, begged them not to do it, they didn't listen, because we have to do what the people want, even though what the people wanted was the opposite of that. But it depends on which people you're talking about, and yada, yada. I mean, I guess there's an argument to be made about the nature of the obstruction of justice questions. I mean, if you win over the entirety of the government, arguably, even if you just win the executive, the unitary executive can call off the dogs. But if you win that and the Congress, and you preclude, I guess, for the entirety of your 4 years, or really in perpetuity, because you can, in fact, be impeached after you're out of office, and maybe it's worth at least reminding ourselves of that. But if you also win over the legislative branch, then perhaps, so long as the judicial branch writes itself out of the formula by saying these are all political questions and you'll have to deal with them politically, and the Congress is in thrall to a foreign power through whatever mechanism as well, whether overtly during the election because they won the majority in Congress through Russian help, or totally by coincidence, and now they're only signing up with the program because they're doing so in an effort to protect their party from the infamy of being found out that the president himself was engaged in a program related to or in complete accordance with a program of treason. And they don't want that because that tends to be embarrassing. It could affect election results, and you don't want that, right? What do you do with the question of obstruction of justice? Arguably, I wouldn't argue it, but they'll argue it. Arguably, you would say, you'd be able to say in court, the United States, the populace went to the polls and they voted for this. Now, it was a little hazy, but the election is what it is. The people in office are who they are, and it's not a crime in itself to pursue world government, right? After all, that you leftist utopian type should be happy about that. We're finally fulfilling the dream we've always told people you harbored of political union in world government with the Russians, though at the time it was because they were communist and we said you were communist because that was a dirty word at the time. You see where this might go. So the third and fourth tracks might very well be erased if the right argument could be made. And by the way, if the wrong and terribly faulty argument is made, or most of the elements don't come together because most voters had no clue whatsoever what the real agenda was, if that even was an agenda, and really most voters would never have any clue what anything was, whether you told them outright or not. That's just true. Well, who gets to decide on questions like that? If they chose to decide, of course, the judicial branch could make those calls, and, well, it'll be easier for them to make those calls if you do things like hijack a Supreme Court seat and keep it vacant for a year and install your own loyal lapdog, or nominate to the bench people as foolish and stupidly unqualified as ghost hunters or what have you, well, then suppose you get a ruling that says, yeah, we'll uphold all of this. Well, then, golly, you're in trouble. This, my first column for The Intercept, is that right? James Risen's first column for The Intercept will focus, or is it the first column of this series? I don't know. That's one of the least important questions here, I think. We'll focus on the first track of the Trump-Russia narrative. Again, that first track, determine whether there is credible evidence for the underlying premise that Russia intervened. Okay? I will devote separate columns to each of the other tracks in turn, so there's at least 4. The evidence that Russia intervened in the election to help Trump win is already compelling, and it grows stronger by the day, which, by the way, if I may just intervene at this point, you should probably just, I know you're laying out the case, but you should go right to number 2 here, or on to number 2. Track 2 would be scrutinizing the evidence to understand whether Trump and his associates have sought to obstruct justice. Oh, I'm sorry, that would be the 3rd track. The 2nd track is we must figure out whether Trump or people around him worked with the Russians to try to win the election. Quite frankly, track 1 and track 2 are boring and the work's been done, but James Risen needs to do it on his own so that he can get to track 3 and track 4. I suppose if you're going to throw out there that there's a death penalty on the line, you can, I'll grant you the luxury of retreading tracks 1 and 2 and us following along. Why not? The evidence that Russia intervened in the election to help Trump win is already compelling, and it grows stronger by the day. I hope there's some more stuff in here than we've already heard, but okay. There can be little doubt now that Russian intelligence officials were behind an effort to hack the DNC's computers and steal emails and other information from aides to Hillary Clinton as a means of damaging her presidential campaign. Once they stole the correspondence, Russian intelligence officials used cutouts and fronts to launder the emails and get them into the bloodstream of the U.S. press. Here he's, I'm sure, speaking of WikiLeaks. Wikipedia, sorry about that, unless you did it. If I find out you did it, I'm coming back for you. WikiLeaks, Julian Assange and the like. Russian intelligence also used fake social media accounts and other tools to create a global echo chamber for both stories about the emails and for anti-Clinton lies dressed up to look like news. And when we say about the emails, we don't mean but her emails, but the emails that were stolen by the hackers. To their disgrace, editors and reporters at American news organizations greatly enhanced the Russian echo chamber, eagerly writing stories about Clinton and the Democratic Party based on the emails, while showing almost no interest during the presidential campaign in exactly how those emails came to be disclosed and distributed. Yeah, that is weird. The Intercept itself has faced such accusations. That is true. The hack was a much more important story than the content of the emails themselves, but that story was largely ignored because it was so easy for journalists to write about Clinton campaign chair John Podesta. And again, I will throw out there that the framework just never existed. Just as the framework really, to this point, doesn't exist for James Risen's contention, overarching contention in this beginning of this series and I guess the series to come. And as there was no real comfortable framework for the media to deal back in 2008, 2009 with the emerging fact pattern suggesting, and in fact really proving, that the vice president of the United States at the very least, and probably the president as well, then George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, among other things, constructed a program of political and military torture in Iraq to try to extract false confessions, true confessions if they could get them, but they didn't exist, so they were going to be false ones, but don't worry about it, from Iraqis and others kidnapped from the streets of Baghdad, and if you tortured them enough and they were willing to say, and it would hold water for long enough for everybody to forget or move on or whatever, that there really was a relationship, say, between Al-Qaeda, the fundamentalist Sunni Islamic terrorist organization, and the Sunni Muslim but secularist Ba'athist Party organization inside Iraq, because they both hated the United States enough to put aside their differences and yada yada. If they could just establish that, even with so-called confessions extracted by torture, that would benefit the Republican Party in its domestic contest with the hated liberals in the Democratic Party, so that they could establish political hegemony and impose, gigantic tax cuts, I guess, among other things. At that point, we wouldn't have been worried about the repeal of Obamacare. Wouldn't have happened yet. But gigantic tax cuts, which they, by the way, got to do anyway. They didn't need to torture anybody for anything when it was coming to giant tax cuts. But, there was an election coming, and though the New York Times did not want to influence the outcome of that election, Vice President Dick Cheney thought torture might be an appropriate way of doing so, and he went right ahead and did that. But that's because he has no editorial board. And also, the nice New Yorkers at the New York Times wanted everything to make sense, and they were, they didn't want to get in the way or be accused by any Republicans who might be able to make them feel bad about themselves of interfering with the election. Anyway, we didn't have any framework for processing that because that was too cartoonish, or perhaps too cartoon supervillain-ish a concept to contemplate. We wouldn't know what the hell to do with that. And similarly, we find ourselves, pondering the same impossibility of getting our heads around the possibility that the President of the United States, whether through any actual allegiance to Russia or Vladimir Putin or not, or perhaps just through a continuing and easily recognizable and exploitable allegiance to himself and nothing else. If I give you enough money, if I dangle enough dollar signs out there, will you do my bidding, whether you know it to be in the interest of the Russian Federation versus the United States or not? The answer is yes, because the president is a simpleton and a dotard and a greedy idiot. Will it work? Let's go find out. All it could cost us is a couple of bucks, and we have lots. Oligarchs will give it away. It's not even my money. Why not try it? And in the meantime, what is the U.S. press going to say about that? Well, geez, I don't know. I mean, maybe both sides do it. Phew, that was close. At least we figured out what to say. So, easier to write about emails and John Podesta, although... Even so, I don't know, no articles about, a lot of people have had to convince themselves that John Podesta's mention of polenta and or pizza was in fact discussion of child sex dungeons that we like to visit in order to make this storyline make sense. And I guess we also didn't have a framework for that either. So I suppose maybe you can excuse it in the other direction. I don't know. Should I write this story about how loony it is for an entire wing of an entire actual political party in this country to stake their claim to the presidency, dominance of Congress, and therefore dominance of the entirety of the government as well through the judicial branch eventually, on the notion that a guy who likes pizza is really wink wink talking about child sex dungeons? I don't know how to approach that, so I won't. And so therefore, her emails. Whew, we're making a lot of hay out of this article. We should just let James rise and talk. But then, get your own show, James. I'm giving you this one. To anyone who has studied the history of the KGB, particularly during the Cold War, the attack on the Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party during the 2016 election looks like the contemporary cyber descendant of countless analog KGB propaganda efforts. Back in the 1970s and 80s, the KGB frequently engaged in ambitious disinformation campaigns that were designed to sow suspicion of the United States in the developing world. The KGB's so-called Active Measures program would use international front organizations, cutouts, and sometimes unwitting enablers in the press to disseminate their anti-American propaganda. Framework issue here just for a second. We believed that one because it was, I wonder if it was because it was easy to believe that people in the third world were simpletons, dotards, what have you. I don't believe they were dotards in the same way as I believe Donald Trump is, but simpletons. That they were already perhaps more open, they're certainly more open than Americans, to the idea that the Americans were evil or plotting against them or plotting against the entirety of the world. And in some cases it was even true, so it was an easy thing to plant. But that would never work here in the United States because we're not simpletons. We don't put on hats that say "Make America Great Again" and allow ourselves to be convinced to yell at and or murder people because economic anxiety, right? We're too smart for that. Framework problem. The most infamous and dangerously effective KGB disinformation campaign of the Cold War was known as Operation Infection. Yikes. With a K. Infektion. It was a secret effort to convince people in developing countries that the United States had created the HIV/AIDS virus. Holy moly. I didn't realize that was the... and is that the name? I mean, it's what we would call it, I guess. We laid the label Operation Infection on, although who knows, maybe that's an actual Russian word. You'd think it would be in italics if that was the case. But that's copy editors shouldn't be my focus in all of this. But I wonder if, like Fancy Bear, Cozy Bear, we are all accepting that those are the names of the groups, and they're not the names of the groups. It's just what we imposed on them. Curious about Operation Infection. In 1983, a newspaper in India, here we go to Patient X on Operation Infection. A newspaper in India printed what purported to be a letter from an American scientist saying the virus had been developed by the Pentagon. The letter went on to suggest that the U.S. was moving its experiments to Pakistan, India's archenemy. Wow. How come the music isn't coming up here? All right. Let's see. Hang on just a second. We're a little bit late on that. Wow. The letter went on to suggest that the U.S. was moving its experiments to Pakistan, India's archenemy. Meanwhile, the KGB got an East German scientist to spread misinformation supporting the Moscow-backed conspiracy theory that the U.S. was behind the virus. Imagine all this coming out at the same time as learning that the CIA was supposedly behind crack. Weird. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show. Boy, oh boy. After just a minute of break up at the top of the hour. And we might as well just plunge straight back into it, because why not? Whew. While all the other issues and controversies and stories swirl around, maybe we're certainly the only ones dedicating this amount of time to this article, and certainly this kind of discussion, because anybody else would be fired for having this discussion on the air, not because of the political content, but because it's taking too long. But that's what we do. And feel free to fire me if you like. We left off finding out a little bit about this Operation Infection thing. KGB, in addition to suggesting via a newspaper in India that the HIV/AIDS virus was developed by the Pentagon as some sort of, I don't know what, biological weapon. The KGB also got an East German scientist to spread misinformation supporting the Moscow-backed conspiracy theory that the U.S. was behind the virus. How outlandish is that? Well, I can get you a U.S. scientist that'll tell you that there's no such thing as global warming and it's all a Chinese hoax. So, what do you think? You think it's possible? While these particular lies never penetrated the U.S. mainstream, they nonetheless spread insidiously throughout much of the world. And I guess we should point out, no, it never made it into the U.S. mainstream, but it did make it into some prominent fringe groups that, some of which, died natural death as irrelevant cranks. Others of which survived to this day and find themselves at the breaking of a new dawn in the Trump era, rising to new prominence, and, I don't know, let's say seeing their members get a hold of weaponry and perpetrate massacres in various settings, of which we are all aware. Let's just throw that out there. Vladimir Putin was a KGB officer during the 1980s when the KGB was conducting this disinformation campaign. So I guess we're supposed to take away from that he would be familiar with their existence and efficacy and interested in improving on them, perhaps. He was stationed in East Germany in the late 1980s, and there is a good chance he knew about the East German component of Operation Infection. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the KGB was broken up and its successor agencies renamed, but the KGB never really went away. Instead, it underwent an extensive rebranding that did little to change its culture and traditions, which is just an alternative disassembly program to, say, debathification or denazification, if you want to go a little bit further back. We learned early on that demobilizing the Ba'ath Party and the Iraqi military just resulted in, well, I guess you could say, an extensive rebranding that did little to change its culture and traditions, but it swapped uniforms for, face masks and cave dwelling, I guess. I don't know. And then they didn't even really move into caves in Iraq. That was a surface ethnocentric dismissal of the vast differences between those fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq because, hey, pass the Doritos. I'm an American. The KGB's first chief directorate, its Foreign Intelligence Service, was renamed the SVR. Like its predecessor agency, it was still housed in the first chief directorate's headquarters in the Yasenevo district, I guess, of Moscow, which was known as the Russian Langley for its similarities to CIA headquarters. I guess if you have two giant spy agencies and two giant Cold War superpowers, putting them in vast office complexes, it's just sort of what we did in those days. And all Ryzen is describing here is, well, fall of the Soviet Union, what are all these people going to do with their lives and their offices and their livelihoods? And they're used to getting up and coming to work, so we'll do it. We acknowledge that the Soviet Union has fallen, so we'll change the signage on the door. KGB to Soviet. Get rid of it, come back with SVR, and then let's just continue, because even if we're not Soviets anymore, certainly we still live in a dangerous world, and the Americans are going to be a little bit still, at least, distrustful of what we're doing, even if they're happy about our overt changes. We got to look out for ourselves. We're still going to need a spy network. Let's just keep going, because the alternative, of course, is demobilizing the vast spy network of the old Soviet Union and laying them off and giving them nothing to do. And it certainly happened to some of them, and I'm sure that they fell into, wherever the money was, and that was the oligarchy / mob that rose in the days following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Moving on. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, James Ryzen in this case, met many former KGB officials in Moscow, including Leonid Shabarshin, the last leader of the first chief directorate, who was running the agency in 1991 when communist hardliners launched a coup against Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. By the time I met Shabarshin, he was retired and running an economic intelligence firm out of an office in Moscow's old Dynamo Stadium, the home of the KGB's soccer team. What? Well, okay. A mural on his office wall depicted scenes from the Battle of Stalingrad and the Bolshevik Revolution, signaling his immersion in the Soviet era, or signaling, that's what was on the wall and we moved in here and I don't have any time or money to repaint the wall. It's a nice mural, and who cares? There was that possibility. After the Soviet collapse, the KGB's second chief directorate, which handled spy hunting and counterintelligence, along with other directorates that handled the KGB's internal police state functions, were bundled into a new organization known as the FSB, the Federal Security Service. I conducted extensive interviews with one of the most legendary spy hunters of the second chief directorate, Rem Krasilnikov, I'm going to guess. At that one, a man whose personal history showed how entwined Russian intelligence still was with its Soviet past. His first name, Rem, was an acronym for Revolutsky Mir, the world revolution Soviet leaders had longed to bring about. Now, I don't know anything really about Russian as a language, but I will point out that Revolutsky Mir is something that's relatively easy to take apart and understand. The translation here given, world revolution, that seems obvious from Revolutsky, right? But haven't we we've been told that the Mir, that MIR, that's the name of the space station. Haven't we always been taught that meant peace? And it very well may, and it may have multiple meanings, and I guess it's just interesting there to see it translated Revolutsky Mir. Revolutsky, we would guess, is revolution. Mir, as we learned from the space station, is peace. Revolution, peace. That does seem a little bit contradictory, but world revolution, this is interesting, right? This is right at that, we talk about constitutional gray areas and the meaning of words being changed depending on the circumstances in a lot of areas, right? Revolutsky Mir, revolution, peace. Well, is revolution peace? Well, as a matter of definition, it's difficult to believe that. Of course, there are such things as peaceful revolutions, I guess, but they typically tend to involve a whole lot of upheaval. And though it might not be violent, it's certainly difficult to describe it as a period of peace. However, if the entire world were to throw off its chains, let's say, and become harmoniously communist, or really become harmoniously anything, then you might very well be able to describe revolution, because it's universal and we all find ourselves on the same page, as peace. How interesting a concept that is. Not what we're talking about here, but just a good side note. I think Revolutsky Mir. So that's the guy's first name, or at least how he refers to himself. My middle name is Danger. Well, my first name is World Peace Through Communist Revolution. Oh, well, it's nice to meet you. You sound like a dangerous fellow. Soviet leaders, to return to the article. I'm sorry. This was the revolution that Soviet leaders had longed to bring about. I glanced at the wrong part of the paragraph here. Rem's father had been a general in the NKVD, the Stalinist predecessor to the KGB. I've heard that before, of course, and I guess it's interesting, having just noted the FSB, the establishment of the FSB was a rebranding of the KGB, and so meant to be seen as a reformist KGB. So here, the KGB, the hated KGB, hated and feared here in the United States, is really a happier face for the old NKVD. We rebranded that into KGB. But as usual in the case, after a number of years, as always is the case in politics, whether domestic or geo-world politics, the reformist bent is lost and it becomes establishment and hated all over again. So, Rem's father had been a general in the NKVD, the Stalinist predecessor to the KGB, and whenever I talked to him, Krasilnikov, how did we decide to say his name? Krasilnikov made it clear that he still considered the United States his adversary. Oh no, so we're back to that. Now can we take the word of World Revolution Krasilnikov as a legal definition for whether or not Donald Trump is engaged in treason or not? I think that's supposed to be the implication here. He proudly took me on a tour of sites around Moscow where he had arrested American spies. No one even bothered to rename the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency. Well, they have still Russia, they're still military and still intelligence, so what would you name them? But, rebranding. We love it here in America. During the Cold War, the KGB considered the GRU a low-class cousin, much as the CIA always looked down upon the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency. Poor Flynn, that's why. Today, the GRU has added cyber and hacking capabilities like those of the National Security Agency. The GRU was involved in the Russian hack of the 2016 American election, according to classified NSA documents obtained by The Intercept, yet it still operates in the shadows of the more influential FSB and SVR. Russian intelligence was briefly weakened following the collapse of the Soviet Union, but under Putin, the first KGB man to run the country since Yuri Andropov dropped off in 1984, it has come roaring back. Does everybody remember that New York tabloid, I don't remember whether it was the Post or the Daily News, headline for Andropov's death? During his KGB career, Putin served in both the first and second chief directorates. One of his key formative experiences occurred in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. Putin was stationed in East Germany at the time, and his biographers have written that the personal humiliation he felt watching the Soviet Empire collapse helps explain his drive to return Russia to great power status. In 1998, Russian President Boris Yeltsin named Putin director of the FSB. Since coming to power himself, Putin has deployed his country's spies in Chechnya, Georgia, the Crimea, eastern Ukraine, and Syria, and probably elsewhere, in a bid to reassert Moscow's global influence. Why wouldn't he be willing to deploy his spies inside the computer systems of the DNC as well? I can think of no good reason. The chronology of the attack on the Democratic Party is a sad testament to the overconfidence of the Clinton campaign. That is another problem. It also highlights the inattention of American intelligence and law enforcement and their failure to adequately warn the major political parties of looming cyber threats to the U.S. electoral system. But again, probably a framework problem there, right? The Russians are coming. The Russians, we're done with that, right? And what you're proposing is so outlandish. Look, he's a joke. He's going to lose. She'll win. The problem will go away. I can see that. In September of 2015, the FBI made a half-hearted effort to tell the DNC that its computer system had been invaded. And computer systems are constantly being invaded. And really, even by that point, they were constantly being invaded by Russians. And we just thought, oh, Russian mobsters are looking to steal credit card numbers. Okay. I mean, bad news, but not this. No, it's not what we thought was happening. In November of 2015, the FBI told the DNC that its computers were sending data to Russia, but even that didn't seem to prompt much concern on the Democrats' part. In March of 2016, Podesta's email account was hacked in a phishing attack, giving thieves access to thousands of his emails. And even then, it was like, well, you fell victim to a phishing attack. Somebody emailed you saying they were Google and asked you to give them their password, and you did it. Is that really, clandestine FSB hacking? Well, it's quick and dirty hacking. They didn't care really how it was done. They weren't into the craft of it. It was probably even funnier to them that it was done so simply. But it didn't match, in our view. It wasn't the Tom Cruise lowering himself from the ceiling to steal the knock list. That we would have been scared of. But, hey, yo, give me your password. Okay, here it is. That's not particularly frightening, I guess. In May of 2016, CrowdStrike, a cyber company hired by the DNC after the party finally recognized it had a problem, told DNC officials that its computers had been compromised in two separate attacks with two sets of malware associated with Russian intelligence. Amazing that I bet they fought about this in the editorial side over at The Intercept, because there's a pretty significant contingent there that I've been given to understand that would immediately have said, CrowdStrike, you can't possibly cite them as a source in this. They're hacks. They're how ironic. They're hacks themselves. We read about them and we can't take their word for anything. They made up the idea of Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. While the DNC used CrowdStrike, a private contractor, to conduct an investigation, it did not give the FBI access to its computer systems. That fact has since been seized upon by skeptics who say that CrowdStrike's analysis can't be considered credible. But according to a November BuzzFeed story, well, there's the answer. CrowdStrike's lead investigator, Robert Johnston, was a former Marine captain, and you can't question a Marine captain, who had previously worked in the U.S. Cyber Command, where he had investigated an attempted hack of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, that would be a hack, I believe, the Russians would launch. That he identified as likely associated with the FSB. He had recent experience in identifying the signatures of hacking linked to Russian intelligence. In June 2016, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange said WikiLeaks had obtained emails, gee whiz, associated with Clinton. Just days later, the Washington Post reported that Russian intelligence had hacked the DNC's computers. In July 2016, just before the Democratic National Convention, WikiLeaks released thousands of DNC emails, and the party's chairwoman, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, was forced to resign. That now seems weird and incongruous, but okay. In September 2016, Senator Dianne Feinstein, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and Representative Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Panel, issued a statement that they had received classified briefings that made it clear that Russian intelligence was trying to intervene in the election. And by the way, by that point, Kevin McCarthy had already been told, and all the arrest had been, of the leadership had been briefed of the Russian operations in Ukraine, working along the exact same lines. And McCarthy said, I think the Russians are paying Trump and maybe also Dana Rohrabacher, but let's keep it a secret. I'll just add that. We believe that orders for the Russian intelligence agencies to conduct such actions could come only from very senior levels of the Russian government. The Feinstein and others letter noted. The key moment in the 2016 campaign came on October 7th when three events unfolded one after another. That afternoon, the Department of Homeland Security and a director of the Office of National Intelligence issued a statement that U.S. intelligence believed Russia was behind the Democratic Party hacks and email releases. The U.S. intelligence community is confident, and it's abbreviated here, USIC, so in case we use that abbreviation later, you'll know, U.S. intelligence community is confident that the Russian government directed the recent compromises of emails from U.S. persons and institutions, including from U.S. political organizations. The statement read, the recent disclosure of alleged hacked emails on sites like DCleaks.com and WikiLeaks and by the Guccifer 2.0 online persona are consistent with the methods and motivations of Russian-directed efforts. These thefts and disclosures are intended to interfere with the U.S. elections process. That statement was immediately overshadowed later that afternoon when the Washington Post published the infamous Access Hollywood tape, in which Trump is heard talking about how easy it is for him to get away with sexual assault, including groping and forcibly kissing women. And yes, that's in the news today too. As a matter of fact, we're never going to get to all this. But it's out there, and I'll give you the articles to read it. It's dismaying. It's distressing. It's Ronan Farrow again, too, by the way. Really killing it for this issue, to be honest. I imagine that had a great deal to do with getting the subject of that article to talk. But maybe we'll get to that. Let's first focus on whether or not we should be executing the president. Okay. Later that afternoon, WikiLeaks started tweeting links to emails hacked from Podesta's account. WikiLeaks then began releasing Podesta emails on a regular basis throughout the last month of the campaign. Meanwhile, a group called DCleaks, which is now believed to be a front for the Russian hackers who sought to intervene in the election, released more Democratic Party-related documents. And yada, 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 everything became fixed election, et cetera, and so therefore the Democratic Party internally has tortured itself for a year following and is about to embark on the next presidential election cycle soon enough, having made probably virtually no changes in how things are happening, and so subject to the same stupid accusations, which I don't really feel had any grounds in the first place anyway. But that'll just make me an establishment hack and sellout come 2019 or so anyway. But we have some time before then. Within days, Trump was telling his supporters at rallies, I love WikiLeaks. But, he loves LAMP is what he was saying. I don't know anything about WikiLeaks. I just heard they did something that distracted from my Access Hollywood tape and might help us in the election, so I love LAMP/WikiLeaks. The scope of the impact of Russian hacking and subsequent disclosures of Democratic Party emails and data on the outcome of the 2016 election remains unclear, but the disclosures certainly helped to take at least some of the media's attention off Trump and probably should be credited with giving him the time to recover from the disastrous Access Hollywood tape. The pattern and timing of the disclosures also strongly suggests that the objective was to damage Hillary Clinton's campaign and help Donald Trump. Was it because they loved Donald Trump or because they hated Hillary Clinton? No one can really be sure. But it could also be a little bit of both, given that, one, they certainly hated Hillary Clinton. Two, they just wanted to have the worst possible president atop the U.S. power structure. And three, it wouldn't hurt if it was somebody that they knew they had by the short hairs, because his whole life depends on maintaining the myth that he is a rich and powerful and successful businessman, and we hold the purse strings on that and can help him either perpetuate that myth or destroy it forever. In December of 2016, a month after the election, the FBI and National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center issued a joint report detailing the cyber tools used by Russian intelligence to attack the Democratic Party. The report is still illuminating today because it suggests that the original DNC hack in 2015 was part of a much broader Russian cyber assault on a wide array of American institutions, including government agencies. Originally, it seems, the Russians were not specifically targeting the Democrats, but were simply casting a wider net in Washington to see who might take the bait. Sure. Is it possible that they might, if had they found different results, could they have undertaken an operation to try and compromise whoever the Democratic nominee was in order to manipulate them and boost their chances versus whoever the Republicans might put up? At that point, it was probably still doubtful that Donald Trump would ever end up being their nominee. Sure, it's possible. Might it have been more difficult? Very likely, yes. I mean, they lucked out unbelievably on the Russian side, having Donald Trump be the nominee, unless you believe they manipulated it from the beginning and talked him into running and manipulated the primaries. Certainly no reason not to believe that they wouldn't have been interested in it, but so far, I don't know. We haven't seen that information just yet, but it's coming in drips and drabs. So the report was still illuminating because it suggested the original hack in 2015 was part of a broader effort. The agency's report determined that in the summer of 2015, an APT 29, or Advanced Persistent Threat, remember that, 29, one of two Russian intelligence, quote, actors identified in the report, also known now as Cozy Bear, thanks to CrowdStrike, right? Spear phishing campaign-directed emails, campaign-directed emails containing a malicious link to over 1,000 recipients, including multiple U.S. government victims. So, again, Advanced Persistent Threat 29 used legitimate domains to include domains associated with U.S. organizations and educational institutions to host malware and send spear phishing emails. In the course of that campaign, APT 29 successfully compromised a U.S. political party. According to this report, the report adds that the Russians quickly followed up when they gained access to the Democrats. APT 29 delivered malware to the political party's systems, established persistence, escalated privileges, enumerated Active Directory accounts, and exfiltrated email from several accounts through encrypted connections back to the operational infrastructure. That's a lot of jargon. They got hacked, or they did the hacking. And here's how. While intervening in the 2016 election may not have been the initial purpose of the cyber attack, once the Russians opportunistically struck gold by breaking into the DNC, they went after the Democrats relentlessly. That'll be the one we'll target, because it's easier. In April of 2016, APT 28, another Russian intelligence actor, compromised the same political party, again via targeted spear phishing, the report states. This time, the spear phishing email tricked recipients into changing their passwords through a fake webmail domain hosted on APT 28 operational infrastructure. Using the harvested credentials, APT 28 was able to gain access and steal content, likely leading to the exfiltration of information from multiple senior party members. By luck or design, Russian intelligence had obtained a vast trove of inside information from the Democratic Party in the middle of a presidential campaign. In January 2017, just days before Trump took office, a remarkable report from the CIA, FBI, and NSA was made public. plunging the U.S. intelligence community into American politics in an unprecedented way. And of course, it must have been obvious to the U.S.ologists of the Kremlin that this would create an enormous difficulty for us. They must have known very quickly that our framework wouldn't be able to handle this. Its aftershocks continue to reverberate a year later. The report states that we assess Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election. It continues, Russia's goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, and harm her electability and potential presidency. We further assess Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump. We have high confidence in these judgments. There's more to it. We'll get back to it in our last segment. Looks like we might not get to anything else today. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Yes, 2 hours on the question. It's going to be a complicated question on should we be arresting and executing Donald J. Trump? Well, that's a provocative question, and I suppose you owe the listeners a couple hours of discussion on whether or not that ought to be the case. My goodness. But this is, I think, a very interesting and coherent narrative. And the fact that it's coming out in The Intercept is significant in its own right. And, well, I believe it is a worthy alternative to further gun control discussion today. Also, further discussion of Donald Trump's 2006 and thereafter womanizing. Also a big story and definitely something I would ordinarily spend an inordinate amount of time on. But I don't know. This one's got me intrigued. It's a complicated story. As I was saying, we were reading an excerpt from the extraordinary report made available, a remarkable report from the CIA, FBI, and NSA in January of 2017 regarding the Russian activities with respect to the U.S. presidential election. It had gone on to say, Russia's goals were to undermine the public faith in U.S. democratic process, denigrate Clinton, harm her electability and potential presidency. Further, we assess Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump, because, of course, they had him, as we said, by the short hairs, because his entire mythos was tied up in their money. So obviously they would have a preference for him. They knew both that they had him compromised and that he didn't care, because as long as they fed him money, he would do whatever they wanted. He was too stupid, in their estimation, I would think, to realize that he was doing Russia's bidding. I'm just doing something for myself, and I love money, and that's enough for me. Does it help Russia? I don't know. I don't care. And to the extent that it helps them, pay me more money, because I think they'll continue giving money. And remember, he believes that he's getting money from Russia because they think he's such an awesome businessman. So he's never going to see what's going on. He makes a perfect mark. The report goes on to say, we also assess that Putin and the Russian government aspired to help President-elect Trump's election chances when possible by discrediting Secretary Clinton and publicly contrasting her unfavorability, or rather contrasting her unfavorably to him. The report also notes that further information has come to light since the election that, when combined with Russian behavior since early November of 2016, increases our confidence in our assessments of Russian motivations and goals. Trump has sought to discredit the report and, by extension, the entire intelligence community ever since. His cronies have chimed in, dismissing it as the work of the so-called deep state. This, too, almost certainly known to the Russians and works to their benefit. Why not? It dovetails beautifully with what we're doing. Yet, interestingly, CIA Director Mike Pompeo, a Trump loyalist who has been criticized for transparently currying favor with Trump in hopes of being named Secretary of State, still stands by the January intelligence assessment. In November, after Trump once again publicly trashed the intelligence community's conclusions, the CIA issued a statement that the director stands by and has always stood by the January 2017 intelligence community assessment. It's not going to do anything about it. Fair enough, right? Well, I stand by it. Okay. Well, what are you going to do? Well, I don't know. What do you mean? What do you want me to do? Well, are you concluding that the president was involved, that he was a traitor, that he should be arrested and tried for treason and imprisoned and or executed? No. And really, quite honestly and frankly, why would you want the CIA to do something like that? That's true. That's a good point. You know what? Stand pat. You stay where you are. We'll take care of it elsewhere. According to the CIA, the intelligence assessment with regard to Russian election meddling has not changed. Pompeo's willingness to stand by the assessment is clearly not in his own political interest, and thus lends credibility to the assessment. Earlier this week, meanwhile, top intelligence officials, including Pompeo and Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats, underlined their ongoing concerns about Russian election meddling, warning that Moscow once again seems to be seeking to intervene, this time in the 2018 midterm elections. Why wouldn't you? In a congressional hearing, Coats suggested that the Russians believe they were successful in 2016. I think they do think so, and want to build on their success in 2018. Why not? As any political party would, by the way, right? Democrats, Republicans, or Russians. Coats said that the 2018 midterm elections are a potential target for Russian influence operations, and that at a minimum we expect Russia to continue using propaganda, social media, false flag personas, sympathetic spokespeople, and other means of influence to try to exacerbate social and political fissures in the United States. Further documentary evidence of Russian intervention in the 2016 election came from an important story published by The Intercept last June. How do you like that? The story was notable because it was based on a classified U.S. intelligence document about Russian election hacking obtained through an unauthorized leak. All the other U.S. intelligence assessments and reports that have so far been made public about the issue have come through officially authorized channels. Thus, the NSA report leaked to The Intercept has the enhanced credibility that comes from being disclosed against the will of the U.S. intelligence community. Or so they want you to believe. Dun, dun, dun. I actually have that music, but okay, I'll just do it myself. The classified report is significant because it reveals that Russian interference in the election extended beyond the direct attack on the Democratic Party and included attempts to gain access to the basic infrastructure. Oh yeah, it's Infrastructure Week. Involved in actually counting American votes. Oh my. It details how the GRU conducted a cyber attack on a U.S. voting software supplier and engaged in spear phishing to try to hack local election officials before the 2016 vote. I suppose if you really, really want to influence the outcome of the elections, you would explore some of that too. Even if, it doesn't matter whether you do or don't succeed. We're doing our darndest. And maybe they want to change vote totals. Maybe they didn't succeed in doing it. Maybe it wasn't necessary, but maybe they didn't succeed in doing it. Maybe they did, and we still don't know it, but maybe they didn't. Why wouldn't they be trying to do that? It's not a blow-off thing to find out that they were trying but didn't make it, right? You don't just set that aside. The classified May 2017 NSA report, provided anonymously to The Intercept, shows that Russian hackers sought to pose as an e-voting vendor and trick local government officials into opening Microsoft Word documents loaded with malware that would let the hackers remotely control the government computers. To fool the local officials, the Russians first sought to gain access to the vendor's internal systems, which they hoped would provide a convincing disguise. In other words, if you could send the email illegitimately, but actually from their servers, if you were suspicious as a local official and you checked it out and you saw, well, this email does come from their server, maybe I will share the password to allow them to, whatever it is, put in the patch that will help fix our computer system and safeguard it from attack, but in fact actually install malware that would allow Russians eventually to simply, change the vote totals someplace, whether perceptibly or not. We don't really care whether we're caught. I mean, I'd rather we weren't, but let's try it. I imagine I would order the same if I were a Russian, because they're an enemy, but not officially, so you can't execute me. You see how that works? Russian General Staff Main Intelligence Directorate actors, and the names here are redacted, executed cyber espionage operations against a named U.S. company in August 2016, evidently to obtain information on elections-related software and hardware solutions, according to information that became available in April of 2017, the report states. The actors likely used data obtained from that operation to create a new email account and launch a voter registration-themed spear phishing campaign targeting U.S. local government organizations. The compromise of the vendor would provide cover for the direct attack on the local officials. It was likely that the threat actor was targeting officials involved in the management of voter registration systems, the report adds. It is unknown whether the aforementioned spear phishing deployment successfully compromised the intended victims and what potential data could have been accessed by the cyber actor. It actually reads could have been accesses, but I'm sure they meant could have been accessed by the cyber actor. The growing evidence that Russia was behind the attack on the Democratic Party now includes the confession of a Russian hacker in a Moscow court. The story of Konstantin Kozlovsky appears to be one of the most significant of the entire Trump-Russia saga. It is one of several intriguing tales now emerging that suggests that the secrecy surrounding the Russian hacking is beginning to unravel. In December of 2017, The Bell, an independent Russian news site, reported on Kozlovsky's stunning testimony in Moscow City Court. Kozlovsky, a young Russian hacker who had been arrested along with other members of the Lurk hacking group in connection with the cyber theft of more than $50 million from Russian bank accounts. I need these guys for privateers of the Caribbean. Testified that he had conducted the Democratic Party hack on behalf of Russian intelligence. In an August 15th court hearing in Moscow, Kozlovsky said he performed various tasks under the supervision of FSB officers, including hacking of the National Committee of the Democratic Party in the USA and electronic correspondence of Hillary Clinton, and hacking very serious military enterprises of the United States and other organizations, according to The Bell. It is a good question. Okay, suppose he did those things. Why would they be prosecuting him? They're not prosecuting him for those hacks. They're prosecuting him for stealing money from the bank. And I guess, I don't know, offering this up is supposed to somehow be a defense. I don't know whether, what their system is like there. Are they supposed to excuse his bank robbery because of the brave operation on behalf of the motherland against the United States? Are they supposed to think, well, it's not really his fault that he stole the money, he was corrupted by FSB officials? I don't know. That seems unclear to me. The news site, The Bell, reported that Kozlovsky said he had conducted the hack at the direction of Dmitry Dokuchev, a major in the FSB's Information Security Center, the intelligence agency's cyber arm. When Kozlovsky made this statement in court, he was already facing serious criminal charges for hacking. He may have thought that claiming involvement in the DNC hack would help him with his ongoing criminal case, or he may have thought that he had nothing left to lose and so should tell all. He remains in pre-trial detention in Moscow. There's a partial answer. Dokuchev, meanwhile, is a fascinating character, and his involvement in Kozlovsky's story plunges it into the wilderness of mirrors of present-day espionage battles between the U.S. and Russia. And the UK is involved too, but okay. In December of 2016, Dokuchev was arrested in Moscow and charged with spying for the United States. He and 3 others have reportedly been accused of providing information to U.S. intelligence on the Russian hack of the Democratic Party. Along with Dokuchev, FSB Colonel Sergei Mikhailov, Ruslan Stoyanov of Kaspersky Labs, and Georgy Fomchenkov, a Russian businessman, have been charged with treason in the case. Can you believe it? Wow. Is that reason for us to do the same or reason for us to avoid it? I don't know. Dokuchaev is now being detained in Russia, but since Kozlovsky's confession was made public, Dokuchaev, through his lawyer, has told the Russian press that he doesn't know the hacker and was not involved with the theft of documents from the Democratic Party. In March of 2017, just months after Dokuchaev was arrested in Moscow for spying for the United States, the U.S. Justice Department announced that he had been indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of hacking Yahoo's network and webmail accounts. Dokuchaev, identified by the Justice Department as a 33-year-old FSB officer, remarkably accomplished at so young an age, was one of 4 men indicted in the case. The defendants used unauthorized access to Yahoo's systems to steal information about at least 500 million Yahoo accounts and then used some of that stolen information to obtain unauthorized access to the contents of accounts at Yahoo, Google, and other webmail providers, including accounts of Russian journalists, U.S. and Russian government officials, and private sector employees of financial, transportation, and other companies, according to the Justice Department. At the press conference announcing the indictments, officials displayed a large FBI wanted poster for Dokuchaev. This chain of events leaves plenty of questions unanswered, but I wouldn't be surprised if Dokuchaev's December 2016 arrest for treason in Moscow and his March 2017 indictment in the United States were somehow related. Like, for instance, I don't know. I mean, this may or may not be what Ryzen is implying, but it might be something you would expect from 2 countries engaged behind the scenes in an effort toward political union, which I don't think is necessarily the case, but it's weird that we're also indicting the same people that they're indicting for treason if he was spying for the United States. On the other hand, why not indict him in both countries if he's a double agent? That seems as likely as anything else. While the Washington press corps has been obsessing over Donald Trump's tweets, and me too, and ginned up memo from House Republicans seeking to discredit the Trump-Russia investigation, me too, another major break in the story has just begun to unfold in the Netherlands. But I saw that one, so I'm off the hook for those two. In late January, a Dutch newspaper, you know the story, De Volkskrant, along with Nieuwsuur, the Dutch current affairs television program, reported that Dutch intelligence service AIVD had turned over to the FBI conclusive inside information about the Russian hack of the Democratic Party. The 2 news organizations reported that in 2014, Dutch hackers, you know the story, they saw it. Working for the AIVD gained secret access to the Russian hacker group known as Cozy Bear, sort of, also known as APT-29, the Russian intelligence unit behind the hack of the DNC. At least it ties those threads together. Dutch intelligence first told their American counterparts about their successful penetration of Cozy Bear in 2014, tipping off Washington that the Russian hackers were trying to break into the State Department's computer system. That warning led the NSA to scramble to counter the Russian threat. In 2015, the Dutch were also able to watch undetected by the Russians as the Cozy Bear hackers launched their first attack on the Democratic Party, according to the 2 news organizations. In addition to gaining access to the Cozy Bear computers, the Dutch were able to hack into security cameras that recorded who was working in Cozy Bear's office in a university building in Moscow near Red Square. The Dutch discovered that there were about 10 people working there, and they were eventually able to match the faces to those of Russian intelligence officers who worked for the SVR. The information flowing from the Dutch was considered so vital by the Americans that the NSA opened a direct line with Dutch intelligence to get the data as fast as possible, according to the Dutch news organizations. To show their appreciation, the Americans sent cake and flowers to the AIVD headquarters in the Dutch city of Zoetermeer. That seems inadequate to the task, but people like cake. Even the president of China likes cake. Right? If the Dutch story is accurate, it would help explain why the U.S. intelligence community is so confident in its assessment that Russian intelligence was behind the attack on the Democratic Party. The Dutch news organizations say that the AIVD is no longer inside the Cozy Bear network, and the Dutch intelligence has become increasingly suspicious of working with the Americans. Since Trump's election, who can blame them? So the Dutch didn't pull out of there because something. I guess they feel like the Russians were eventually tipped to their presence. I don't know when and whether that was under the administration of Donald Trump or not, but I guess that's strongly implied. And that's it. We're done with part one of James Risen's question. Is Donald Trump a traitor? I believe the answer in 1 part, 4 parts, no parts at all is yes. But we've set up an amazing question for ourselves. What if it's true? What are you going to do about it? Suppose we grant that it's true. Suppose Donald Trump grants that it's true. What are you going to do about it? That's a good question. Okay. So I said there's other stories out there. There are. There's the gun stories. That's a big deal. Information being developed, by the way, we're going to have to squeeze a lot of things into the last 10 minutes or so. Information being developed that may or may not be true, because everything has to be questioned at this point, that the shooter in the Florida, Parkland, Florida shooting was, I don't even know why we call him a shooter, the murderer, the mass murderer, we might as well just lay it out there, is a Trump fan. We, of course, saw him on his Instagram account wearing his Make America Great Again hat. But there's this weird instance that's happening out there that I don't know what to make of exactly, that a particular white supremacist group in Florida that calls itself the Republic of Florida, ROF, claims quite openly that he was a member and that they trained him. And I don't know why they would do this. And there are some weird and inconsistent parts of the story, such as the founder of this ridiculous group insisting that he had, personally mentored this guy and was in constant personal contact with him, although they live several hundred miles apart. And I don't know what to make of this thing. I mean, there is this ROF group. Whether or not the murderer of Parkland was actually engaged in their activity, I don't know. Now there's a second round of reports that seem to imply that perhaps it's a 4chan joke of some kind, a hoax to establish this connection. Sometimes, of course, we see in things that even Republicans will call terrorist attacks, like when ISIS claims credit for things, we will very often see people claiming credit for things that they actually had nothing to do with, but it helps in their agenda, so they go ahead and do it. Maybe we're seeing the same thing. By the way, if it's a 4chan hoax of some kind, it's like, shouldn't we now not be just like basically arresting and systematically disposing of the members of the 4chan groups? I don't know. They seem to be the worst possible people, the worst people in America here at this point. But it's out there. What we'll make of it, I have no idea. And I just want to mention just for a second, this idea of the ROF. I mean, I don't know why they don't just say that, yeah, they're a terrorist group. Yeah, they're a Klan group. Well, they're white identitarian, we call them, as opposed to, and some people are just coming out and saying they're white supremacist. But apparently the goal that they allege for themselves is establishing a white ethno-state in Florida. And by the way, just good luck with that. Not honestly, obviously. But, I mean, yeah, it's like they just adopt the boilerplate language from other racist groups and aren't serious about developing their own platform themselves. And thank God that they're too stupid to actually be that organized, that they realize, you can't just say we're going to establish a white ethno-state in Florida. It's like, it's one thing if you want to try to pull that in, I don't know, Alaska, where it really is 97, 98, 99% white, and you might have a shot at pulling it off. But to say, oh yeah, we're going to expel everyone of color from Florida? I don't know. They're just a bunch of jokers at this point, but they are killing people. And so, maybe we ought to take that seriously. And another of the pieces of information being developed by reporters and outsiders elsewhere is just documenting the literal atrocities. How many times in the run-up to the election and the ascension to prominence of the alt-right and then the empowering of white supremacists with the election of Donald Trump, how many times these latter-day brown shirts are actually going out there and murdering people, and maybe we ought to consider them dangerous at some point. There's more news on arguably less pressing grounds. Yes, Donald Trump was chasing after Playboy models all the time and having ostensibly consensual sexual relationships with them, but they are now speaking to Ronan Farrow and expressing their regrets and illustrating the system by which Donald Trump and, for instance, his attorney Michael Cohen and others constructed a system to suppress news about his serial infidelities and how they used their money and their newspaper and non-disclosure agreements and contracts with people to pay them off to get them to shut up about affairs. That's a bad thing, but where does it fit in the panoply of bad things we are coming to learn about Donald Trump? I don't know. And then there's this one, and I'll throw it out because it's Friday and we've discussed it before, and it's a big story now, and I would like to ring the Kagro in the Morning Told You First bell on this one, even though it wasn't exactly what I told you. So I'm going to claim credit for it anyway, because why not? YOLO, nothing matters, right? Trump's inaugural committee paid $26 million to a firm owned by one of the First Lady's top advisors and close friends. Maggie Haberman, Ken Vogel, hate them, love them, I don't know. They're reporting good stories. We're going to have to take this tidbit. You can criticize them later if you want. President Trump's inaugural committee, which has no obligation to report on any of its expenditures, in which we told you they might use to pay themselves inordinate amounts of money, although we have never yet established that one, has instead paid the money to a friend o' Melania's. President Trump's inaugural committee paid nearly $26 million to an event planning firm started by an advisor to the First Lady, Melania Trump, while donating $5 million, this is an interesting side note, less than expected, to charity. According to tax filings released on Thursday, we actually have the inaugural committee's tax filings. Isn't that interesting? The nonprofit group that oversaw Mr. Trump's inauguration and surrounding events of January 2017, the 58th Presidential Inauguration Committee, has been under pressure from liberal government watchdog groups to reveal how it spent the record $107 million it raised largely from wealthy donors and corporations. Its chairman, Thomas J. Barrack Jr., a longtime friend of Mr. Trump's, had pledged that the committee would be thrifty with its spending, and they didn't have much to spend it on because nobody went, and would donate leftover funds to charity. In a statement released by the committee, he praised it for carrying out the inauguration and more than 20 related events with, quote, elegance and seamless excellence without incident or interruption, befitting the legacy and tradition that has preceded us. Without interruption, of course, we are now prosecuting people left and right for that interruption anyway, but whatever. The mandatory tax return it filed with the IRS revealed heavy spending on administrative and logistical expenses associated with planning and executing several days' worth of events that nobody attended for donors and supporters around Mr. Trump's inaugural ceremonies. By contrast, the return showed that the group's charitable donations included only a previously publicized $3 million for hurricane relief, as well as $1.75 million to groups involved in decorating and maintaining the White House and the vice president's residence, and $250,000 for the Smithsonian Institution. So $107 million raised, $3 million for hurricane relief, and then the other nearly $2 million it's claiming as charitable contributions went to decorating where the president and Mike Pence live. It's a legitimate charitable recipient, but it's not really what we thought we were going to get from this guy. The 116-page filing indicates that the majority of the funds, more than $57 million, which is about what the entirety of Barack Obama's inaugural fund was, went to 4 event planning companies. And consider that there were like no events attended by anybody at this thing. Amazing. The top recipient, the biggest payment, $26 million, was WIS Media Partners of Marina Del Rey, California. Now, records show that the firm was created. It's got a long, these are established players in the event planning field, so you can't blame them, right? Created in December of 2016. About 6 weeks before the inauguration. And its founder, according to a person familiar with the firm, was Stephanie Winston Wolkoff, a longtime friend of Mrs. Trump's. And really, honestly, Mrs. Trump doesn't have any longtime friends. And I've got the wrong music rolling. We're going to have to, that's my commercial music. We're leaving you, but for different reasons. I mean, she's got friends, and I guess they're sort of longtime friends. But remember, when did she when did she move to this country? 2005? There can only be about 10 years. Now, that's a long-time friendship, but not if you're, 40, 50 years old, whatever. Anyway, Stephanie Winston Wolkoff, longtime friend of Mrs. Trump's. Otherwise, there's very little information available about the company. She made her name planning Manhattan Society galas. An associate of the Vogue editor Anna Wintour, Miss Winston Wolkoff traveled in the same circles as Mrs. Trump, who attended Ms. Winston Wolkoff's 40th birthday party, wowee, in in 2010. Ms. Winston Wolkoff has subsequently been brought on as a senior advisor to the First Lady's official government office. So just to sum up here, as we have to hand things over to Justice Putnam for the follow-up show here, $26 million out of the inaugural funds, about which, there are no obligations for how you spend the thing, went to Melania Trump's friend. It could have gone to Donald Trump's friend. It went to Melania Trump's friend, who also works for the White House, like right now. Like, that's not any kind of a problem at all. There's plenty more in this article. You have to read it for yourself. Now, of course, time to hand things over to Justice Putnam to summarize every goddamn thing else that happened between yesterday and today.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
I hope you don't feel like I let you down in some way. If you feel like you haven't caught up on the stories of the day, do stay tuned for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. What about the $10 million that the NRA has been subsidizing mass murderers with for all this time? What about Russia? What about Alex Navalny? What about everything else? Well, stay tuned. There's more to come.